Hi everybody. Welcome to my first attempt at making a screen capture video for you. In this video, I'm gonna try to go over all of the materials I just posted for you about making or writing what I call an observation assignment. The observation assignment is kind of a deconstructed partial essay. Um, and the reason that I structured it this way is because what the observation assignments ask you to do are things that you're going to have to do in your essays eventually. So with these observation assignments, I ask you to read text in a certain way, to notice things about text in a certain way, and explain those things that you notice, and then comment on those things that you notice. So I'm going to try to walk you through that a little bit right now. So what you're looking at right now these aren't published just yet, but this big text header right here, these are the instructions on how to go through these observation materials. I felt like one of the best ways to teach you would be to go through them with an example. So I'm going to ask you to read a short story and then read a sample assignment for observations, and then read a sample observation itself that I wrote today. So the first thing I ask you to look at is this overview here. Let me stretch this if I can. So this overview talks about how making observations is really the foundation of literary analysis. We make observations all the time. You hear my dogs barking in the background? You might get some pug video for a treat later. So what this webpage talks about is, again, how the foundation of literary analysis is making observations. And you can't even help but make observations. You can't help but notice things when you read. So one of the first things you're going to be doing when you write on your own in this class is I'm going to ask you to read a packet of 3 Little Red Riding Hood stories. One's called The Grandmother, one is called Little Red Cap, and one is called Little Red Riding Hood, I think, in that order. And they all have a lot of similarities, and they all have some differences. So what I'm going to ask you to do is, in this sheet here, I just recap the basic Little Red Riding Hood story, and then I walk you through how to make observations about it. So I retell the story right here. And then down here, I slow the story down, I interrupt it, and after each little snippet, I ask some questions about it. So y'all probably remember the story of Little Red Riding Hood. There's a little girl, she's young and beautiful, she wears a red cape, her mom sends her off into the woods, etc., etc., etc. What I ask you to do is to take those very simple details and think about them and question them and look a little bit deeper. So I will let you read this. But that's all I mean. I'll let you read this on your own a little bit later. But that's all I mean when I say make observations at first, is to simply notice things. So one of the first things you'll be doing in this class is learning how to read stories closely and notice things, look at them a little bit more deeply, and kind of explain what you notice. So I'll go ahead and click next. So this next web page is talking about how these observation assignments work. And so as I mentioned, the first thing that you'll do in an observation assignment is you'll be asked to notice some things. Just notice what you see in the story. And what we're going to start with is character traits. And so character traits are adjectives that describe a character. So right here, for example, in Little Red Riding Hood is described as young and beautiful. She also does some stuff in the story that could label her as other traits. So the first 2 parts of the observation that I'm going to ask you to write ask you to look at Little Red Riding Hood's character traits, and then the traits of the Big Bad Wolf, or the wolf as he's called in most of these stories. The third part asks you to do something a little different, which is to comment on what you read in the story. And I'll explain that a little bit later. These observation these observation assignments might feel a little different to you because they have a very specific structure. So they're a lot like study questions in one way, but I ask you to do a very specific structure so that you're very aware of what you're doing. So here's a little another note on noticing and commenting. So to notice things again means to read the text closely and look for patterns. To comment is kind of like to comment on what you're reading or the patterns that you're noticing. So the observation assignment sheets, they're all going to require you to use headers and subheaders. And again, this is to make the organization really, really straightforward so that you know what you're doing and what you're doing in your own writing. One thing that I've noticed, especially early in 123 classes, is that it becomes really easy to kind of just start talking and not know what you're doing and kind of gloss over things. And so I structured these in this way to avoid that. Especially when you're reading fairy tales, it becomes really easy to focus on like what's the moral of the story. For example, in Little Red Riding Hood, if you remember, the moral of the story is don't stray off the path or listen to your parents or whatever, because that was Little Red Riding Hood's first mistake. When she strayed off the path in the forest, she fell into the clutches of the big bad wolf and bad things happened to her, or bad things almost happened to her. So early on, I'm structuring things in a different way so that we move beyond the moral of the story and look at more interesting, deeper things that are going on there. So the first thing, like I said, I'm going to ask you to do, and you'll see this assignment sheet a little bit later, is I'm going to ask you to notice Little Red Riding Hood's character traits. Then I'm going to ask you to notice the wolf's traits. Then I'm going to ask you to comment on some key differences between versions of Little Red Riding Hood. So first I ask you to notice things, and then I ask you to explain what you notice. So one thing that students often accidentally gloss over or move too quickly through in English 123 essays, especially early on, is they will kind of accidentally let the evidence speak for itself. That is, when they notice something in the text, they'll just say that they notice it and then move on without explaining kind of what it means or how they think that it fits in a pattern. So you'll see an example of that later. But in the observations, I break these two things up. Notice there's a bold subheading here for noticing. This is where you simply record what you notice. It could be a paraphrase or it could be a summary. In the case of these first couple of observations, you're going to say, I see red as having this character trait. And then you'll give an example of why you see it. Here, in the explanation, in parallel for the same trait, you'll explain a little bit more about why that thing from the story, whatever it is you saw, shows that she has that character trait. Might seem a little weird at first because the fairy tales are so straightforward. A lot of fairy tales do a lot of telling. That is, they'll just tell you, for example, that Little Red Riding Hood is young and beautiful. So that might be all you say, but you can add a little bit more explanation to it, and you'll see what I mean. Later, so I think it'll be hard for you to resist offering a lot of interpretation. I think it's very, very natural. We're so good at consuming media and consuming texts that as soon as we notice something, we start to make interpretation and we start to draw larger conclusions. So when I ask you to present commentary, that's where you do that kind of thing. So the observations will unfold a little bit like an essay. They'll kind of ask you to make one set of observations or to notice one set of things going on in a story, then maybe to notice another set, and then comment on what you think those things mean or what the significance is. This will mirror exactly the structure of the essays moving forward. I'm going to ask you to structure your essays in a very similar way, to lay out a pattern, to maybe lay out another pattern, and then to begin in the end of your essay, the final third of your essay, to probably talk about what you think those things mean and to explain that. So again, these observation assignments are highly structured kind of mini essays. Okay, so what I did next, after kind of laying out what these observations are and how to structure them, I give you a really brief example with Little Red Riding Hood. And again, as I say right here, there's a full example posted on Canvas that I'll return to probably in the second video here. So if I was you guys and I was writing a observation on these Little Red Riding Hood stories, I would start off by saying, my header would be noticing Little Red Riding Hood's character traits. And you can optionally insert a colon here and elaborate a little bit. I would say to start with, she's young. That's a really basic one, and I kind of don't mind giving that to you. You can use young or not. So what I wrote here is, one of the first traits that is central to Little Red Riding Hood's character in all three versions of the story is simply that she is young. In the story of Grandmother, Red, for she is not named in the story, is first referred to as the daughter of a woman who made some bread, and then twice in the next few lines as the little girl. Later when she meets the wolf refers to her repeatedly as my child. So all I did here is very basic, and this is exactly the kind of thing I want you to do, is introduce the story. You have to orient the reader, introduce the character, and then introduce the reader to some of your evidence, which is that she's young. So Red is young because she's referred to as the daughter of this woman. She's referred to as the little girl, and she's referred to as my child. So that's all you need to say in this part of the observation about that particular trait. And then you're going to do one more thing and then one more thing, all in this paragraph here. Once you've done that, you explain it a little bit. Do a little bit of explanation for each trait. So here's what I did. Although it seems obvious, it also must be important that Red is described as young so many times in all three of the stories. In the first story, it is especially interesting that the young woman doesn't even have a name. Perhaps this means the fact of her being young and being female is the most important part of her identity. And as I note, I could go on a little bit here, but for purposes of the example, I don't want to. Then I would have a transition to the next trait. In fact, I would start a new paragraph, which you'll see. In addition to being young, another important trait that Red shows is that she is blank, blah, 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 whatever. You guys will find a handful of traits for Red very easily. Okay, so that's enough for now. In the next video, I'm going to go to this next assignment, or next page, which is an example assignment on the robber bridegroom. Okay, I'll be back with you in a second with the next video.